Hey, friend, welcome back to the YouTube channel for the Renaissance English History Podcast. I am your host, Heather. I've been podcasting on Tudor England since 2009 with my show, which makes it the original Tudor History Podcast. Channels where I put all of my content from all of my shows, as well as tons of extra videos like this one right here. Today is May 19th, so it is a very important day in Tudor land, in Tudor history land. Because it's the anniversary of the execution of Anne Boleyn. So we're going to talk today about the execution of Anne, the final hours of Anne Boleyn. But before we get started, just your friendly reminder that if you want to see more Tudor history in your YouTube feed, why don't you go ahead and hit subscribe so you never miss a video that I put out. All right, so it's May 19th, the Tower of London. It was just after dawn. It was a Friday, May 19th, 1536, and Anne had been awake all night inside the Queen's lodging at the Tower waiting for the end. She had already dressed. She was wearing a dark gray gown with a red kirtle underneath and a cloak trimmed with ermine. Those who saw her that morning remarked on her composure. Someone even said that they never saw her more beautiful. Sir William Kingston, who was the constable of the Tower, even he seemed surprised at how steady she was, which he wrote in his letters. Outside, a scaffold had been built on Tower Green just yards away. The swordsmen, of course, had been brought from Calais by special order that was seen as like kind of one last mercy by Henry VIII. He had arrived earlier that week. Her execution actually had to be delayed a day, they think, because the swordsman was a little bit late in actually arriving in London. Some people, though, I will also say, lean towards the idea that Henry was still a little bit undecided about a couple of things, namely whether her sentence should be commuted, or if not, if she should be allowed to be buried in consecrated ground. So there was some delay going on. She thought initially she was going to die on the 18th, and it was moved to the 19th. Anyway, Anne knew exactly what was coming. She was not allowed a confessor, but she did request the Eucharist. At about 7 a.m., she received communion, likely from her almoner, John Skip, and apparently she swore her innocence once more before taking her communion. According to Chapuis, she declared that she had never been unfaithful to the king. Taking communion the morning of an execution wasn't unusual, but Anne's behavior did stand out. Kingston later reported that she took the sacrament with great devotion and seemed more ready to die than any creature I ever saw. There was no confession of guilt, only a firm insistence on her own honesty. She remained consistent in claiming that she had not committed any adultery or treason. Her final hours were, of course, being closely monitored. Kingston reported every detail to Thomas Cromwell, who was pulling the strings behind the scenes. Even Anne's body language became evidence in the record. He described how she actually made some dark, kind of macabre jokes about her own execution. She apparently said, "I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have but a little neck." And then she laughed. It's one of the most chilling lines in the entire story, half gallows humor, half effort to stay in some kind of control. Anne had expected to die at 8 a.m., but the execution was delayed yet again, this time because the scaffold wasn't ready and the crowd hadn't fully assembled. You can't have an execution without the crowd being fully assembled. Duh. Sir William Kingston had to tell her that she would need to wait yet again. Anne reportedly took the news with a calm acceptance, though there are some accounts that suggest that she showed some visible signs of exhaustion at this point. Of course she did. She'd been up all night. She's exhausted. She spent the next hour with the women assigned to her in the Tower. These, of course, weren't her friends. They weren't her confidants. They had been chosen for their loyalty to the king, but they had shared her last days. And according to Kingston, Anne told them to be brave and not to weep. She reminded them of her innocence and the peace she had made with God. When Kingston entered the room again at 9, she told him that she was ready. She was still steady and still composed, and she had already arranged her headdress and her clothing so that nothing would delay the swordsman. Just after 9, she was led from her chambers across the courtyard to the scaffold on Tower Green. There was only a small crowd, about a couple of hundred people. This wasn't a huge public spectacle. It was deliberately kept private. This is the first time a queen had ever been executed, especially by a king, and they really wanted to control the narrative of it as much as possible. So it was held within the Tower walls. It wasn't public. It wasn't like at Tyburn. It wasn't on Tower Hill where people could see. It was within the Tower walls, and it was deliberately private. There were only a few noblemen there, some Tower officials, and her ladies. Kingston noted that she walked with a goodly countenance, holding herself with dignity. Anne gave a short speech, very carefully worded, of course. She didn't confess to any crime, but she asked those present to pray for the king, calling him the most gentle and sovereign lord and saying that he had always been kind to her. It was a final show of obedience, likely encouraged, if not required. She, of course, was thinking about her daughter Elizabeth and keeping Elizabeth safe. She expressed hope for salvation and forgiveness, and then she knelt down. Unlike executions by the axe, Anne's would be swift. The French swordsman had been instructed to act quickly and cleanly. She removed her hood and blindfolded herself, praying aloud as the moment approached. She was saying things like, Lord Jesus, accept my soul. My soul belongs to Jesus. Lord Jesus, accept my soul. The executioner stepped quietly behind her. The sword was already in his hand, but according to accounts, he called for his assistant to bring him the weapon. It was a distraction so that Anne wouldn't flinch. She kept praying, to Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul. And as he called for his assistant to bring him the sword, her head turned, looking at the noise, looking to where the assistant would be, to where he was calling. And that exposed her neck in the cleanest sort of way. So the sword fell cleanly in one stroke. Anne was beheaded instantly. There wasn't any cheering. There wasn't any ceremony. Her ladies were weeping, and they gathered her body and her head into a linen cloth. She was buried just steps away inside the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula in an old arrow chest because they hadn't remembered a proper coffin. A Queen of England without a proper coffin. There weren't any bells ringing. There wasn't any public mourning, anything like that. That same day, Henry announced his engagement to Jane Seymour. So in a couple of the books that you read, especially Alison Weir books, she talks about the idea that some witnesses say that Anne's lips were moving when they held up her head. Of course, they held up her head and say, this is what happens to enemies of the king. And there are some accounts that her lips were still moving. I mean, now look, there's the idea that your nervous system, that things are still kind of moving, right? Because it doesn't all shut down instantly. But Alison Weir actually did some deep research into this, researched this type of death and all of it. It's a little bit queasy. It's a little bit queasier than where I'd like to go with this channel and this video, because it's also a little early in the morning for that. But there is an idea. I'll link to the video if you actually do want to get into it, where Alison Weir explains the research that she did and whether or not people die instantly. And you can read about it in her book too, The Lady in the Tower. I think she goes into the detail about that. I actually read it right before bed. I finished it right before bed. It was years ago, but I remember being like having a really hard time getting to sleep after having read it. So if you're queasy about stuff like that, tread carefully before you read it. But, it is there if you want to check it out. All right, my friend. So there we go. A little bit about Anne Boleyn's final hours and remembering her today on the anniversary of her execution. If you made it this far in the video and you enjoyed it, I sure would appreciate it. Press that like button. It helps to feed that algorithm and get our videos to even more people. And I hope I earned your subscription to my channel where I put out content like this on the regular. If you want to keep binging Anne Boleyn content, here's that interview I did with Alison Weir a couple of years ago where she kind of talks about Anne's death. And here is a video that YouTube thinks you'll enjoy. Thanks so much for being here. Remember, you are deeply loved. I'm so glad I shared this planet with you. I will be back very, very soon. Don't forget to drink your water, friend. All right, bye-bye.